We'll start our meeting at this time. We have enough members here. Our witnesses are in place, and the time clock suggests that we should have started a couple of minutes earlier. So let's get started at this stage. I do not see Michael Bach. Perhaps we will start with the second one. We have the Canadian Finance and Leasing Association, David Powell, the President and CEO. We thank you for coming and being here. I'll introduce the rest of the panel as I yield you the floor. We are in a very tight timeline today. We have votes. Just to let the committee know that we will be interrupted, and we're hoping to cut our panels a little tighter and be able to be completed by that time of the vote. So with that, we will yield the floor to you. 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've titled our submission to the committee, Reinforcing the Foundations for Growth and Prosperity. For us, the formula is clear. More investment in people and assets leads to economic growth, and economic growth raises the standard of living of all Canadians. First, let me describe briefly what our industry does and the role it plays in Canada's prosperity agenda. The core of what we do is asset-based financing. After the banks and credit unions, our members are the largest providers of debt financing to Canadian businesses and consumers. Our focus is financing specific assets, essentially equipment and vehicles, and our industry has over $106 billion worth of financing in Canada today, an amount that's doubled over the last 7 years. If you think of our members lease everything from aircraft to big rig trucks to cars, recreational vehicles, photocopiers, office equipment, and the printing presses that you see in corner printing shops. Our key message is that the very nature of what we do targets productive assets. The growth in leasing is not a tax-driven phenomenon, it's efficiency-driven. So how does our industry specifically fit in the national prosperity agenda? Well, how about the fact that our industry contributed 8% of the total increase in living standards of Canadians over the period 1992 to 2002, which is the most recent period studied by an independent economic research firm that does work for the Department of Finance as well. In this first of its kind research demonstrated that our industry has a significant impact on raising the standard of living of all Canadians. Specifically, the study found that, and I quote, the rise in asset-based financing from 1992 to 2002 improved living standards in Canada by 2.3%. That's 2.3%. We asked two noted economists to review this research, Dr. Jack Mintz, then head of the C.D. Howe Institute, and Jim Stanford, chief economist of the auto workers. Both of them reviewed the research and supported its conclusions. Dr. Mintz said, and I quote, the industry contributes a disproportionate share to higher living standards. So we're here today because we believe that our industry is an important part of Canada's productivity, economic growth, and national prosperity. We'd like to share with you 5 messages as you proceed with your work. First message is that the public and private sectors must, in our view, concentrate their efforts on growing the economy. The demographics are clear. Canada's getting older, and the workforce is getting smaller. How can fewer people generate more wealth to support more people and services? Through improved productivity. To do so, Canada must have a highly educated workforce, efficient public infrastructure, and productive capital assets. A highly educated workforce is mobile. It will go where the jobs are. To keep the jobs here, we need efficient infrastructure and capital assets. Our second message. Investment in equipment is key to greater efficiency and enhanced productivity in today's more competitive marketplace. The appreciation of the Canadian dollar has forced some sectors of the Canadian economy, notably those that depend on export markets, to invest more heavily in machinery and equipment over the last 5 or 6 years. Productivity in the manufacturing export sector has seen a cumulative increase of nearly 11% since 2001. New equipment has allowed manufacturers to boost output while reducing factory hours. The high dollar has forced such trade-oriented sectors in Canada to work smarter. Domestically focused sectors have not followed suit. Our second message, enhance the positive strengths of the competitive marketplace in Canada. When I asked my colleagues south of the border what motivates their customers to acquire new equipment to make their businesses more efficient. It comes down to one thing, essentially. It's competition. It's looking over their shoulder at their shoulders at their competition in Florida or Texas or California. If they don't equip themselves with the smartest people and the best equipment, they're not going to be able to compete. The U.S. experience shows that a competitive national marketplace stimulates innovation, investment, and productivity across the domestic economy. This is a greater motivating force for investment and innovation than any number of complicated government financial incentives. Efforts to encourage more competition in Canada have been less successful, with too many entrenched interests not wanting them to succeed. Government policy still inhibits capital investment, and Canadian companies too often seem slower to invest in their foreign competitors. Message 4. The federal government should lead a national coalition. Yes, sir.
Very quickly.
The federal government should lead a national coalition for growth and prosperity, serving as a catalyst and its champion. This is our primary message. We should focus tax policy on investments in productive assets. Tax policy is critical to capital investment. The government should be congratulated for encouraging capital investment in its 2006 and 2007 budgets. We applaud the intent to provide a more favorable climate for businesses to accelerate or increase their investment in machinery and equipment. Thank you.
We'll now move on to the Canadian Food Association. We have Penelope Merritt, the President and CEO. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Merci. Je m'appelle Penelope Merritt.
Thank you very much. My name is Penelope Merritt. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Health Food Association. We are the largest professional national association, and we represent the industry of natural and organic products.
My name is Penelope Merritt, and I am the President and CEO of the Canadian Health Food Association, also known as CHFA. CHFA is Canada's largest trade association, representing the whole supply chain from growers, manufacturers, retailers, importers, distributors, consultants, and other associations involved in a variety of subsectors in the industry: supplements, vitamins, herbals, homeopathic medicines, sports nutrition, and organic foods, health and beauty aids, and other organic products. Natural health products have become increasingly popular as Canadians look for better ways to manage their health. In fact, over 75% of Canadians purchased natural health products in 2005, according to an Ipsos Reid survey. This industry is currently valued at over $2.5 billion, and it is growing. The Canadian organic foods industry, for its part, is one of the fastest-growing sectors in Canadian agriculture, growing at the rate of 20% last year and boasting sales of $1 billion in 2006. We are very excited about the prospects of our industry, as more and more Canadians are seeing the benefits associated with the usage of natural health products and organic foods. Our industry, though, currently faces important challenges. As the demand continues to expand for these types of products, CHFA believes that the government needs to take specific steps to address industry and consumer needs. We ask that the government enable a tax framework that promotes citizens' health while stimulating industry growth. But first, we'd like to commend the government on its recent announcement to reduce the corporate tax rate for small businesses. This is, we believe, an important step in reducing the tax burden on our members, most of whom are small and medium-sized businesses. We ask that the government continue to support our entrepreneurs to allow them to prosper in the Canadian economy and beyond. We have a number of tax-related recommendations in our brief. We believe these incentives would provide for a stronger framework for our industry. I would like to recommend on behalf of CHFA and its members to the committee that the following tax-related steps be taken. First, allow for support to farmers for transition from conventional to organic agriculture. Second, allow natural health products to be recognized as medical expense deductions. Aside from these tax measures, we are also very concerned with the regulation of natural health products and organics in Canada. We would like to see the committee members to consider the importance of providing adequate funding for federal government-regulated bodies. CHFA recommends that A-based funding be provided to the Natural Health Food Directorate to ensure it has the necessary resources to implement and enforce regulations which affect the more than 40,000 natural health products currently in the Canadian marketplace. As a result of the new natural health product regulations which came into force in 2004, The NHPD has had to deal with a serious backlog of license applications. We recommend that additional funding be provided to the Directorate to ensure that the backlog is dealt with quickly and sufficiently. Specifically, a greater number of resources is required for a limited amount of time of 2 to 3 years to ensure the backlog of some 20,000 applications are reviewed and processed. CHFA also recommends A-based funding to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to ensure implementation, compliance and enforcement of the new organic regulations. These regulations will give Canada a competitive edge in food exports and will enable Canada to join more than 40 other countries worldwide that already have regulatory frameworks in place. As Canada moves forward on these initiatives, long-term sustainable funding models must be in place to ensure regulations have meaning. Funding models that provide certainty to regulatory work should be adopted. Thank you, members of the committee, for giving us the opportunity to be heard. We hope that you will recommend tax measures in the next budget which will help our growing industry. We also hope that you will recommend A-based funding be provided to the regulatory bodies in the federal government responsible for the monitoring of regulations pertaining to natural health products and organic products. Merci pour votre écoute.
And thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.
We'll move on to the Canadian Home Builders Association. We have Richard Lynn, President, and I believe you are accompanied by John Henward.
Yes, thank you very much.
5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I am President of the Canadian Home Builders Association. I'm also a builder in Nova Scotia. And as you indicated, I have with me the Canadian Home Builders Association Chief Operating Officer, John Kenward. Yeah. The CHBA has made its written submission to the committee. We have also updated it to reflect the further 1% reduction in the GST. And we have provided copies for you to pick up there on the back table of our submission supporting housing affordability and choice, as well as copies of an updated edition of our supporting document, the Canadian Housing Industry Performance and Trends. The focus of my remarks will be specifically on the submission supporting housing affordability and choice. But I would like to start with a little bit of context that CHBA does acknowledge the actions of the federal government in several areas, specifically the further reduction of 1% in the GST, and that with the earlier 1% reduction certainly greatly helps housing affordability across Canada. And further, to acknowledge that the government has met its commitment on the GST and has illustrated its support for home ownership across Canada. CHBA also recognizes the government's efforts to address the skilled trades shortages, particularly its new labor market and investment strategy and its actions with regards to immigration policy. CHBA also welcomes the federal government commitment to the infrastructure funding. And the industry continues to be pleased with its working partnership with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We note that CMHC's value goes far beyond mortgage insurance. Its value is especially significant in technical research, in market analysis, in information distribution, and project demonstration, particularly in energy efficiency and environmental concerns. Now, the Canadian Home Builders Association pre-budget submission raises 5 central matters. The need, 1, to adjust the GST rebate thresholds for new home buyers. 2, the need to expand the definition of substantial renovation. 3, to tackle the underground economy head-on, which means replacing the contract payment reporting system now in effect and currently grossly ineffective, and also requiring that all businesses have a federal business number. 4th, there's the need to reform tax measures for rental housing investment, particularly to examine the zero rating of investment in housing rental housing production, and also to re-examine the definition and application of the capital gains tax deferments. And fifth, there's the need to monitor federal infrastructure investment to make sure that it does go to the areas of greatest interest to the government and to Canadians: clean air, clean water, clean land, and efficient roads and transit. Now, I would like to take a couple of those to just go into a bit more detail, Mr. Chair. With respect to the GST rebate for the new owner purchases, we emphasize that this input is nowhere near the promise that was made 16 years ago, and the housing prices have increased enormously over the past 16 years. For example, in Toronto, in 1991, 65% of new home purchasers qualified for the full rebate. In 2007, only 20%. This situation is common in the large centres such as Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary. It's also a serious situation in many smaller centres such as Abbotsford, Ottawa, Montreal, St. Catharines, and Halifax. Now, with regard to government action to tackle the underground economy, the Canadian Home Builders Association continues to be disappointed with the lack of effort on the part of the Canada Revenue Agency in this matter. And with regard to the rental housing market, private investment in this area is not meeting projected requirements simply because the federal tax regime is biased against private investment in rental housing production. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope I have stayed within my 5-minute allowance.
You're actually a little over, but that's okay.
My fault.
We've seen worse. We'll move on now. We'll move up to the Canadian Association of Community Living. I think, Michael Bach, you're at the table, so we'll hear your 5 minutes.
Right.
Starting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my apologies to the committee for being late, but I was stopped by global media when I came in because of a very distressing case of a woman with an intellectual disability being assaulted on Wheel-Trans in Toronto today, and they were asking for comments on that. And in fact, that goes to the core of what I would like to talk about today. We're an association that our mission is to advance the full inclusion and rights of people with intellectual disabilities in Canada, and we work very closely with the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, the Canadian Association of Independent Living Centres, and over the last year, 90 other disability organizations across the country who came together to work to produce this National Action Plan on Disability. This statement represents a consensus agenda of the disability community, and we had the opportunity to present it last week to the Honourable Minister of Social Development, the Honourable Monty Solberg, as well as Minister Flaherty, both of whom attended our end exclusion event last Thursday. This agenda lays out 4 main priorities that our community has identified. Access to needed disability supports, personal attendance, aids and devices is the #1 priority, along with addressing poverty of Canadians with disabilities. We recognize that that is a jurisdiction of the provincial territorial governments, but we call on the Government of Canada to take leadership with provinces and territories to address that issue, as 2/3 of Canadians with disabilities lack 1 or more needed supports. The other major area that we've come to a consensus on is the need to alleviate poverty. Canadians with disabilities of working age face poverty rates twice the general rate of poverty among Canadians, which is just over 13%. The poverty rate of Canadians with disabilities is about 27%. For people with intellectual disabilities living on their own, it's an astronomical over 70% live in poverty. We think that there are some very practical measures that the Government of Canada can take within its jurisdiction and within the tax system to begin to take significant steps to address poverty of Canadians. We applaud the steps of the current government to establish the Registered Disability Savings Plan, to establish an Enabling Accessibility Fund, to establish a disability supplement to the working income tax benefit. These are important measures, but they don't. And I think in implementing them, there has been a recognition that much more needs to be done. The one thing that our community is coming together around in this country is refundability of the disability tax credit, and that's what we're calling for. The disability tax credit provides a face at its face value is just about $6,700. In terms of income tax relief, it provides a value of about just over $1,000, and there's provincial territorial credits on top of that. The Department of Finance has said that the purpose of the DTC is horizontal equity, so that after disability-related costs, taxpayers would pay roughly the same amount of tax. We believe there should be a broader understanding of horizontal equity that would mean that all of those who have disability-related costs would be treated equally. So those who currently don't pay tax, the poorest of the poor among Canadians with disabilities, can't take advantage of the disability tax credit. The organizations you see here, especially the Canadian Association for Community Living and the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, have engaged the Caledon Institute of Social Policy to prepare a costing of what it would mean to make the disability tax credit refundable. If we did that, we could enable about 650,000 Canadians now living in poverty to take advantage of the refundability, and we're suggesting take the highest rate of the DTC with the supplement in Saskatchewan. That's currently the highest rate at about $1,700, and that would be put $1,700 into the poorest of the poor among Canadians to address needed disability-related costs that they can't get deducted through the medical expenses tax credit or the disability supports deduction. We think this is a very practical, very focused measure. The costs are significant, we recognize, at $1.3 billion, but we have not seen a major investment in disability in this country, and I think put in the scale of other major transfer programs to what we recognize as vulnerable Canadians, children living in poverty, seniors, OAS, GAS, veterans allowances. I think it's time to recognize that Canadians with disabilities are another vulnerable group deserving of the kind of attention that those other vulnerable populations have received. So we would call on the department or on this committee to help us take this recommendation forward, and we think it's a very legitimate role for the federal government. We're not calling for a transfer to provinces. We're calling for a transfer to the most vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable groups in Canadian society. Thank you for your time. And
thank you very much for your presentation. And we'll now move to the Canadian Institute of Chartered... Oh, hold it. No, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. So we have Gary Walters. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to appear and provide input to this year's pre-budget hearings. My name is Gary Walters, and I'm Vice Chair of the Institute's Member Services Council. Ladies and gentlemen, too few Canadians are saving too little to generate adequate retirement income. Your committee invited feedback on the tax system needed for Canada to ensure a prosperous future. In our view, a healthy private pension system is a crucial component of such a future. The tax system is instrumental in facilitating and encouraging retirement savings and, most importantly, company pension plans. In particular, I'm here to talk about defined benefit pension plans. These have seen significant decline in the past decade or more, and we strongly believe that saving and improving them is essential for millions of Canadians. Allowing their continued erosion weakens the whole pension system. Before picking up on the tax-focused recommendations included in our written submission, who are actuaries and why are they interested? Actuaries are business professionals who are trained to analyze the financial consequences of risk. Much of our work involves the design and pricing of insurance, pension, health, and other benefit programs, and the modeling, measurement, and management of financial risk. In serving the public interest, Canada's actuaries have a history of contributing to key public policies. The future of defined benefit pension plans is at risk. Committee members have no doubt seen news reports that a growing number of companies are converting their defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans. From a public policy perspective, this is most unfortunate, given that defined benefit plans provide some certainty to plan members' retirement income. A move to defined contribution plans creates uncertainty and makes the plan member responsible for the investment risk and increasing longevity risk. Individual Canadians then face the very real risk that their retirement income runs out before they do. There are a number of issues that have contributed to the shift away from defined benefit plans. For example, court decisions and regulatory changes around surplus ownership have created unanticipated costs and uncertainties for pension plan sponsors. Funding a pension plan is essentially a very long-term exercise. Short-term fluctuations can be quite significant. Witness the recent declines in equity returns that have turned around in just the past 12 months. But the long term is much more predictable. However, the tax rules, which take a very short-term view and limit the build-up of surplus, have been a contributing factor to recent deficits and plan sponsor uncertainty. They've limited the ability of plans to maintain consistent contribution levels by using surpluses in good investment years to fund shortfalls in bad investment years. The Institute has designed a 10-point prescription for Canada's ailing pension system, a copy of which was attached to our submission. 3 of the points call for changes to tax legislation, which would help secure benefits and reduce uncertainty in the defined benefit field. We believe that the higher levels of pension plan funding are required to improve the security of member benefits. A target solvency margin that recognizes the volatility of pension plans and their assets would establish a risk-based approach to plan funding contributions. We recommend that a task force be set up with representation from pension regulators, the Department of Finance and the Institute to review the research and establish a target solvency margin framework. We also recommend that the Income Tax Act and regulations be amended to facilitate the concept of a target solvency margin, which would permit contributions to fund pension plans up to this higher level. We believe that many plan sponsors would be willing to fund defined benefit plans more securely if they knew that they could access surpluses that might arise from their excess contributions. A pension security trust is an innovative way to facilitate this improvement and the concept of the target solvency margin. Basically, it's a side fund owned and funded by the plan sponsor. Solvency deficiency and other payments beyond normal contributions would be placed in the pension security trust. If subsequent valuations show that some of the assets in the pension security trust are not required, the excess fund could be released back to the plan sponsor. So we recommend the establishment of a tax-deductible pension security trust under the Income Tax Act and regulation in order to facilitate these pension contributions. We believe that considering the volatility in pension returns, the current level of allowed surplus in pension plans is too low. Currently, plan sponsor contributions must be suspended when the surplus reaches 10% of actuarial liabilities. We therefore recommend that the Income Tax Act and regulations be changed to permit a higher surplus before plan sponsor contributions must be suspended. In summary, Canada's actuaries are convinced the loss of defined benefit pension plans ultimately hurts working Canadians. Thank you for your time.
And thank you very much for your presentation. Now we'll move on to the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. We have with us Kevin Dancy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As in previous years, our analysis, comments, and recommendations are contained in a written submission which was provided to the committee in August. In our remarks today, we wish to highlight certain areas of that submission that we consider particularly important: debt reduction, sales tax harmonization, and the need for a single corporate tax rate. Canada's Chartered Accountants applauded the news that the national debt was reduced by $14.2 billion in the 2006-07 fiscal year, and that an additional $10 billion has been committed for debt reduction this year. Despite significant reductions in recent years, the level of federal debt equates to approximately $14,000 for each Canadian, well above provincial debt burdens. Interest payments currently stand at $34 billion, and based on the government's own estimates, we will not see an appreciable reduction in these yearly amounts over the next 5 years. Advantage Canada notes that the level of debt charges exceeds combined federal spending on national defense, employment insurance benefits, and international assistance. We recommend that the government accelerate the pace of future debt reduction beyond that outlined in the economic statement, so that a debt-to-GDP ratio of 20% is reached by or before the 2013-14 fiscal year. In order to achieve this goal, we call for a minimum annual debt payments of $5 billion rather than $3 billion. For the past few years, the CICA has been calling on the federal government to lower corporate taxes as a means to enhance the productivity, competitiveness, and overall growth of the Canadian business sector. Prosperous and growing businesses generate jobs and tax revenue, and that benefits all Canadians. We were therefore very encouraged by the business tax reductions outlined in the economic statement. The government's commitment to reduce the general corporate tax rate to 15% by 2012 is a positive step. The question of who bears the burden of corporate income tax is an interesting one. Some would argue that the impact falls only on corporations themselves. That tends to be the political spin, but there's a growing body of evidence which suggests otherwise. Studies show that businesses deal with taxes like any other cost. They either pass them on to consumers in higher prices, force them back onto salary and labor costs by reducing wages of employees, or reduce returns for owners and shareholders. Looking back to 1998, conclusions reached by the Finance Department supported the economic argument that businesses ultimately do not bear taxes, but simply pass them on. Increasingly, there is evidence that corporate tax ultimately falls primarily on labor incomes. A recent study in the UK suggests that any increase in corporate tax is passed on in the form of lower wages. Another study in the US conducted last year confirms that wages are significantly responsive to corporate tax rates. Closer to home, the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity puts it in relatively simple terms. Corporations don't pay taxes, people do. The evidence is clear. High business taxes reduce wages for employees, and this is particularly true in small open economies like Canada. Reducing corporate taxes should be a bipartisan issue. Many countries around the world, on all sides of the political spectrum, are coming to this realization and aggressively reducing corporate taxes. Canada cannot be left behind. Accordingly, we'd like to see a faster action aimed at moving the corporate tax rate in line with the lower small business rate. In short, we would like to see faster, deeper cuts. A single rate would bring much-needed simplification to the tax system by eliminating the rules currently needed to differentiate between large and small business income. Moreover, there is evidence that reducing the corporate rate could actually increase corporate tax revenues. Finance should ensure it models the true costs, if any, of further tax cuts. This would increase the effectiveness of the government's fiscal management. Our submission also calls on the federal government to renew its efforts to make sales tax harmonization a reality across Canada. The economic statement notes that provincial sales tax harmonization would substantially improve our business tax competitiveness. We urge the government to move aggressively to provide the financial incentives necessary to complete this process. And finally, the government must continually monitor capital cost allowance rates to ensure they correspond to the economic life of the asset, which will encourage investment. The combination of lower corporate taxes, sales tax harmonization, and appropriate CCA rates would greatly assist Canadian businesses, and particularly manufacturing businesses, in dealing with a stronger Canadian dollar and the productivity challenge they face.
Quickly.
It would also directly incent businesses to grow in Canada, to become global champions with their head offices based here in Canada, which is a key priority. Mr. Chairman, this concludes our comments in support of our written submission. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
And thank you very much for your presentation. We'll move on to the Railway Association of Canada. Bruce Burrows, Vice President, Public Affairs, Government Relations. The floor is yours. 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, bonjour. The Railway Association of Canada, or RAC for short, is pleased to have the opportunity to submit the views of its membership regarding measures that the Government of Canada must take to improve the competitiveness of Canada's rail system and the economy as a whole. Railways are an important part of the Canadian economy, moving approximately 65% of total freight to domestic and international markets, employing more than 35,000 people, and paying more than $1 billion in taxes. The RAC represents some 60 freight, passenger, short line, and regional railways, virtually all of the railway system in Canada. The RAC has reviewed the questions pertaining to Canada's tax system as outlined by this committee. And though the RAC will concentrate on tax issues specific to the Canadian rail industry, we believe that Canada's tax system must be internationally competitive, encourage investment and savings, and attract foreign investment. In particular, the RAC would like to see the Canadian tax system reflect the Government of Canada's overall public policy to improve air quality and protect the environment. Such a tax system will better enable rail to make investments that will yield significant public benefits. Railways enjoy an intrinsic fuel efficiency and emissions profile advantage over the other transport modes. So now let me speak specifically to the issue of capital cost allowance for rail rolling stock. The rail industry is highly capital intensive. Canada's railways are spending over $2 billion in order to maintain their infrastructure and ensure that they can move their goods in a safe and cost-effective manner. The REC supports the recommendation of the Standing Committee in their 2006 pre-budget report to complete a comprehensive review of CCA rates to determine three things: the extent to which similar asset classes are equitably treated, whether Canada's rates are comparable with those other countries, and whether these rates reflect a useful life. Further, the REC supports the recommendation of the Standing Committee on Finance to permit rail equipment that reduces noise pollution and vibration to be reduced at a faster rate than their useful life. It's also important to note that the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry made similar recommendations, and they were very supportive of moving rolling stock rates to over 30%. The current CCA rate for rolling stock is just 15%. It takes 20 years for any new piece of rolling stock to be fully depreciated. The current CCA rate is not in line with similar asset classes such as truck, tractors, and other modes. They're all in the 30 to 25% range. Railways are also in direct competition with U.S. roads. Containers arriving from Asia can be moved by the U.S. or Canadian routes. The depreciation rate for rolling stock in the U.S. is approximately 30%. As such, U.S. roads can fully depreciate their rolling stock in 8 years versus 20 years for Canadian railways. This puts us at a significant disadvantage. In fact, let's look at a few statistics. Rail Power Technologies, based in Montreal, using state-of-the-art technology developed in Canada, manufactures hybrid locomotives. They can reduce emissions by 80 to 90%, including GHGs, and they can save up to 150,000 litres of fuel per year per locomotive. Rail Power is Canada's own. The current CCA rate does not reflect the useful life of rail rolling stock. Locomotives contain a great deal of electronic systems which are replaced or upgraded every 3 years. They may look the same, but every system and component under the hood is replaced in 3 to 8 years. The RAC has undertaken a cost-benefit analysis of increasing the CCA rate for rail rolling stock to at least 30%. With a $400 million spend every year, it's estimated the fiscal cost to the government will be in the range of $5 to $6 million in year one, moving up to $20 to $25 million on a fully phased-in basis. This is very modest. The benefits of increasing the CCA rate would accrue not only to Canadian rail companies, but supply and component companies, which would increase production to meet the industry's new spending requirements. As outlined above, the current 15% CCA rate for rail must be increased to at least 30%, and this would be very much in line with their useful life, to be comparable with other assets and to ensure that we are internationally competitive. Thank you very much for allowing the REC to appear before you today. It should be noted that the REC has also outlined some further recommendations to the committee, but technological change is sweeping every facet of our industry. So our prime focus here today is to emphasize the need to finally modernize the CCA tax treatment of rail equipment in Canada. This will attract the additional investment needed to address our environmental and innovation challenges. I'd be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to the question and answer part of the meeting, and we will start with, we're going to do 5 minutes.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
What's that?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order.
Yes, go ahead.
Je voudrais qu'on
I'd like for us to dispense of my motion, which is under item number 2 of committee business. I'd like for us to discuss this motion immediately and put it to a vote, because otherwise we will not have any time to deal with it at the end of our meeting, since we have votes right after. I'd like for us to debate the motion that I have tabled.
And we'll move now to the questioning. 5 minutes.
We have no problem with that, Mr. Chairman. If there's no debate, we have no problem with that.
No. I realize the issue. I'm not going to allow a motion on the table. I've talked to the mover about this earlier.
It's just that
are you going to start with your questioning, Mr. Taylor?
All the slots. No, it's on the point of order, Mr. Chairman. It's not just on the point of order. It's because all the slots have been moved.
You cannot move a motion on a point of order.
We're not moving a motion.
I believe that's.
We're not moving. I'm speaking.
j'ai demandé qu'on traite de la motion.
I ask that we deal with this motion immediately. My point of order is that we deal with this motion now.
Accepting that. Mr. Telegny, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is to Mr. Lind. Mr. Lind, what kind of impact is the subprime mortgage south of the border having on the housing industry locally?
The impact is secondary, as from what we're seeing is the way that affects people's attitude towards investment. The other aspect, though, is what we're watching very carefully are whether we may see some of that kind of subprime activity taking place here in Canada, which would affect the investment regime here. And I would ask John Kenward to speak specifically to perhaps some of the numbers on that.
Well, Mr. Chair, we're very, very fortunate in Canada not to be going through the experience that they've had in the United States with the subprime market. And at the moment, there's no evidence that we are faced with such a problem. Nevertheless, the Canadian Home Builders Association does believe that with a more competitive mortgage insurance market, which we endorse, there should be conditions placed on the government's guarantee that it provides to mortgage insurers, conditions which would very much limit, if not prohibit, the emergence of subprime activity in Canada.
Mr. Lind, you're from Nova Scotia. In Ontario, there's also a big concern about the lack of skilled trades in the construction industry. Do you have any idea what kind of cost that has on the industry?
Mr. Chair, yeah, it's not only Nova Scotia and Ontario, it is indeed across the country that the lack of skilled trades is affecting house prices. For example, in Alberta, the lack of skilled trades means that a number of houses, in fact most houses, have to sit for several weeks, even several months, while the various trades become available to do the next phase of construction. Having a house sit waiting for the trade to be available means that there are significant increased costs in carrying that project for that additional time, so that there are severe effects to the home buyer because of this lack of skilled trades to keep the production moving along efficiently.
And which gets to my final question, which is one of the affordability index and as well as what it means to the supply of rental housing. Affordability index to buy housing and the impact on rental housing.
John, could I ask you to address that specifically through the chair?
Mr. Chair, one of the matters that Mr. Lind raised in his presentation was the need for reforms to Canada's tax regime for private rental investment. We're not measuring up to projected requirements in this country, and therefore in relation to the entire issue of housing affordability and the opportunity for people to find accommodation that they can reasonably afford, this is definitely a very serious problem. And as you know, rental markets are very, very tight in many places across the country. So it's certainly an issue of housing affordability. It certainly becomes a related issue with respect to the entire question of how we go about helping those in housing need as well across the country.
Okay, Mr. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Barrows from the Railway Association of Canada. You talk about an increase of 30% on the capital cost allowance. Now, am I correct in understanding, Mr. Barrows, that you were calling on the government to adopt the recommendation that was put forward by the industry committee, adopted unanimously? And do you believe that we should adopt that measure as soon as possible?
Yes, I'm fully supportive of that measure.
¿Y por qué razón?
For what reasons?
Well, For the reasons as I outlined, as I said in the brief, both the Standing Committee of Finance and the Industry Committee have both in the past supported a 30%, minimum 30% capital cost allowance rate for rail rolling stock on the basis of supporting investment in new green technology and supporting the investment imperative, or at least the innovation imperative at large for new and more efficient technology.
Merci, M. Barreau. Mon autre question pour M. Bach.
My next question is for Mr. Bach. In my riding, there is a woman who is the mother of a very disabled child. She wrote a book about caring for this child some 18 hours per day and having to care for her spouse as well. As we speak, it would seem that tax credits for disabled persons are inadequate. They're insufficient in order to provide support necessary. Would you be in favor of adding additional tax credits for those who have to give care to highly disabled persons? Something similar to the disability grant allowance, rather. But in the case of this woman who wrote this book, don't you think that such a tax measure would be interesting? Otherwise, don't you think such a tax proposal would serve well?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I guess one of the things that we've learned as a community as we've tried to move forward a disability and a family supports agenda in this country, there's so much to be done. And we find when we put the full agenda on the table, people go, oh my gosh, this is just too much. What we're trying to do is narrow and do some pieces one at a time. There's no question that families are being driven into poverty in this country. Families who have children with significant disabilities are twice as likely to be living in poverty, twice as likely to run out of money for food in a month. So we've basically made families the front line of care for Canadians with disabilities and for seniors. When we talk about funded disability supports, people with disabilities get their supports funded and served by community agencies, or only 20 to 25% of people with disabilities get all their needs met by community services. 80%, 75 to 80% of supports in this country are provided directly by families. The costs to women, primarily, are extraordinary. They're not in the labor market, they don't have income security in their future years, and they're much more likely to live in poverty. They're much more likely to have lower health status than other women. So there's no question that we need to work on both sides of this equation. Help create a floor that's going to have the 100% more Canadians with disabilities begin to get out of poverty and begin to provide families an opportunity to participate in the labor market while they care for their child or family member, and significantly increasing the infirm and caregiver credits and allowances in the tax system are one way to go. As well, we believe, another measure that's possible, we believe, is to provide some recognition in the Canada Pension Plan for women who have stayed out of the labour market their entire lives to do frontline care for family members with disabilities.
Now we'll move on to Mr. Lemastro. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to start by thanking all of today's witnesses for your comments and also for the submissions to the Finance Committee. I wish I had time to ask questions of you all, but I don't. So I'm going to zero in on a couple of them, but understand that all of your recommendations will be considered by the committee. Mr. Burrows, certainly. I look at the rail industry twofold. One, it's serving the need of reducing congestion on roads and providing safe transportation, and it's also environmentally the right way to move freight, at least in the quantities that the rail industry is moving them on. And I know that the rail industry is constantly building its overall capacity, and it's certainly an industry that's not without competition. Now, you've mentioned CCA rates for rolling stock. Would changes in our CCA rates result in significant investment here in Canada?
Yeah, yes, it would. It would most likely result in at least another $400 million of investment. And in fact, those are the base numbers that we use to calculate the tax impact that I mentioned, starting at $5 million a year, working up to $25 million a year. So yes, it would be significant in both locomotives and rolling stock. And that would help, as I answered Mr. Creet's question, help address the environmental agenda, but it also would allow us to be competitive with both our U.S. rail competitors and the other modes in Canada.
Would it have a safety benefit as well?
No doubt, whenever we have the most modern equipment in use, that's a benefit for safety. Safety can always be better, and that's a prime, probably #1 objective of the industry, to be the safest mode. We are the safest part of the rail industry in North America here in Canada, but that doesn't mean that we stop focusing on that objective. So yes, it would certainly help.
Thank you. Mr. Dancy, thank you for appearing before the committee again. I enjoyed listening to your comments. I think the Institute of Chartered Accountants has some good advice for government. You spoke about the HST, and I was also going to ask a question as to whether or not the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants had a position on interprovincial trade barriers.
Certainly, I guess anything that breaks down like that makes labor or capital or services to flow more freely across borders, that's always a good thing. I think all you have to do when you do that is just make sure that you have the right standards. Well, what can often happen when you break down various trade barriers is that you get a race to the bottom in terms of standards. So you just have to make sure you have the appropriate standard. For us, that's not a particular issue because CAs have the same standard across Canada. But you know, in like certain areas, you really just have to make sure you have the right standards.
Thank you. I had the opportunity to take a number of economics and accounting courses at university, and often I will bring up the point that lower tax rates don't mean lower government revenue. And that's often misunderstood by some of the members of the committee. Could you just take a moment and perhaps get into that a little deeper and explain why lower rates don't necessarily mean lower revenue for government?
Yeah, basically two things I will talk about. One is that the combination of lower tax rates, sales tax harmonization, etc., it really incents businesses to grow. And when they grow, they create jobs, they create value, they earn money, they are more incentive to have their head offices here in Canada as opposed to outside Canada. So there's that incentive. Also, when you get into the technical areas of tax planning, you hear a lot about transfer pricing, right? In the sense where there are various fees charged around the world to perhaps shift profits from country A to country B. If you're in a country with a very low tax rate, you tend to get more income coming in than expenses being charged to that area.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Claire, you have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Powell. I'd like to refer you to the first page of your submission. You say the following: too often, policy and regulations. I'm just quoting the second last page. Tax measures confine industry to the economy of the past, and greater competition is such that Canadian companies are not able to invest substantially. Mr. Powell, can you give us any examples of what you're talking about? Thank you very much for your question, sir. With respect to national policy, very often we've encountered obstacles between provinces, obstacles in interprovincial trade. For example, we have dealt with consumers' rights on a particular committee that I sit on, and we have noted that the federal government and the provincial governments have not been able to agree on one single definition of what a consumer is. So if you want to operate a business in this country, you are forced to deal with various definitions. This incurs costs, which are often passed down to the consumer, or quite simply, this deters our members from setting up shop. One of our first demands is that the federal government take on the responsibility of acting as a catalyst and open the debate on the need to increase productivity and to work in a more intelligent way. Question: what we're currently experiencing, though, given the appreciation of the value of our dollar, is a sort of instability, an imbalance. The oil and gas sector is causing instability. The manufacturing sector, which has been flourishing since the Second World War, in fact, for the past 60 years, we've been trying to build a manufacturing sector with well-paid jobs, is hollowing out. Now, the Conservative government boasts about allowing corporate tax cuts, and yet there are forestry sectors and agricultural sectors which are not posting any profits. And yet the government is allowing for tax cuts to the oil and gas industry, which is destabilizing our economy. Now, if I understand what you're saying, this is a mistake for the government. Otherwise, the tax policies are actually going to harm sectors that are going through difficulty right now. But you are saying that we need to have an open market. We, however, believe that the government has to be proactive. Don't you believe that the manufacturing sector as well as the forestry sector needs assistance through focused government intervention? Or do you believe that the sectors are going to have to be confined to an economy of the past?
I think, to be more precise, one of the elements that we've come to believe is that a competitive marketplace is a very important component in terms of inciting companies to become more efficient and more productive. If you look at a sector like the automotive sector goes through serious challenges, and it's going through a serious challenge right now. But the fact that Canada, Ontario, produces 20% of the automobiles in North America is because that industry and its workers, the unions, have seized on an ability to become more productive. They've become more skilled as skilled labor. They're supporting much higher salaries. Our argument is that one of the challenges Canada faces is that we don't have a competitive enough marketplace to incite Canadian companies to become more efficient and productive. If you look at the study just produced 2 weeks ago by Statistics Canada, it talks about foreign-owned companies operating in Canada. What do you see? You see that the foreign-owned companies in Canada are the plants of foreign-controlled firms are generally larger, have a higher labor productivity, pay more per worker, and have a higher percentage of their employment in white-collar workers than domestic firms. A comparison of the extended impact of innovation activity of domestic and foreign-controlled firms shows that foreign-controlled firms innovate in all sectors more frequently than do Canadian-owned companies in almost all size categories. I put that down to the competitive pressures.
Thank you very much. That ends the question and answer part of our meeting. And I would ask the witnesses, and I'm going to inform the committee, normally we break as we bring another panel of witnesses. We're not going to do that. If you would just retreat from the table, and I thank you for your testimony, and we will bring the other panelists forward, and we'll start immediately with our first panelist because our time is very, very tight. Because we have votes that will interrupt the committee's normal flow. And then we are, just to let Mr. Crett know, we will be dealing with the motion right after that panelists are done and the questioning. So we have then from the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, we have Rick. Where is Rick?
Richard Larrabee. He's right there. He's in his fine uniform.
Where? Okay. We have the Association of Fire Chiefs. We have Rick Larby, the Fire Chief of the Ottawa Region. 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Rick Larrabee, and I am the Fire Chief here in Ottawa. I am with you today, however, in my capacity as a member of the National Government Relations Committee of the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs. On behalf of the Association and the almost 1,000 fire chiefs who comprise our membership, thank you for providing this opportunity to present our pre-budget views. Underlying this brief is our thesis that a prosperous society needs more than just financial security. The fire services regard safety as an inalienable right of all Canadians and a key to national prosperity. An overwhelming 97.7% of our survey respondents said that the federal government has a significant role to play in ensuring that all Canadians receive a basic level of protection against fire and other perils. The previous Standing Committee posed 3 specific questions on various aspects of the federal tax system. Our responses to the Committee's questions number 1 and 3 provide recommendations as to how the taxation system can be used as a tool to improve the safety of Canadians and thus enhance the prosperity. Corporate taxation is not a fire service issue. Therefore, this brief did not address question number 2. The Committee's first question asked whether changes made to taxes, fees, and other charges should be broadly based or targeted. From our perspective, the safety of citizens and of the fire services personnel who protect them can best be addressed through targeted approaches. We then go on to describe how the tax system can be used to encourage the installation of automatic sprinkler systems in existing non-residential buildings and existing residential high-rise buildings. The tax system can also be used to provide the owners of low-rise residential structures with a tax incentive to install such systems in these buildings. The third question deals with issues surrounding the personal income tax system. Our major recommendation in this regard is that volunteer firefighters and their officers should be entitled to a personal income tax credit. Of the 3,492 fire departments in Canada, 3,184, which is about 91%, are volunteer departments. Of the firefighting personnel in Canada, 84,314, that's 78%, are volunteers. The volunteer component is facing severe problems relating to recruiting and retaining the personnel required to protect the citizens of their communities. Thank you. Without measures to encourage volunteers, municipalities will face either diminished protection or increased taxation, neither of which will enhance their prosperity. Previous versions of this committee have shown themselves in favor of additional financial recognition for the work performed by the volunteer fire service. In its report tabled in the House last December, during the previous session of the Parliament, the Standing Committee wrote as follows: "The committee believes that volunteers and the hours of service they give are important to the fabric of our nation. In some cases, such as emergency service workers, they provide essential services that otherwise would not be performed or that would be performed by municipalities and funded by higher tax rates. Volunteer service is, in our view, an activity that deserves recognition." In the previous Parliament, when the Standing Committee decided to kill Bill C-273, it said, "Whereas the committee is generally supportive of the intent of Bill C-273 and feels those who provide volunteer emergency services should be recognized by the federal government through the tax system, there are unanswered questions. Therefore, the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs again recommends that a personal income tax credit be made available to volunteer fire services personnel. We have provided the Standing Committee and the Finance Minister with a comprehensive documentation on this issue, and we find it difficult to understand the government's continued intransigence. A major problem facing volunteer fire departments is the hardship experienced by employers, especially of smaller and family-owned firms, when their employees respond to calls. Accordingly, we have recommended a tax credit for the employers of volunteer firefighters in recognition of the business losses these employers face. Your kind attention to our concerns is deeply appreciated. Thank you.
And thank you very much. We'll now move on to the Canadian Urban Transit Association. Bernard Demars, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Un réseau de transport urbain solide.
A strong urban transit network is absolutely crucial to the healthy economy of a locality. This is an issue of the utmost concern for all Canadians. Increasingly, Canadians understand that investment in a safe and secure public transit system is a healthy investment in our future.
Reid poll conducted for CUTA are contained in our written submission, which you may wish to review at a later time. I will point out now, however, that according to the results, it is evident that many Canadians are concerned that governments are not striking the right balance to meet their community's transit infrastructure needs. It is clear that you, as a committee, have selected several questions related to the balance of taxation and support of various types of public good provided by countries. CUTA would like to directly address this area of study as it relates to public transit. Il n'est pas inutile de rappeler que le Canada est le seul.
It's worth noting that Canada is the only country among G8 countries which, at the federal level, does not have any national funding policy that is sustainable and predictable. We have to correct this. This will allow urban transit systems to fully realize their potential.
National transit strategy has been proposed by Big City Mayors Caucus of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Together with FCM, CUTA is urging its implementation by the federal government. Implementing a strategy such as this will be beneficial to all Canadians, providing an opportunity to maintain, renew and expand transit services across Canada, providing federal tax incentives for individuals who choose transit, and ensuring that transit operations are more effective, efficient, among others. I cannot reiterate enough just how urgently new investment is needed. Canadian transit ridership grew by more than 10% in the first half of this decade. Many transit systems are serving more riders than ever, while also facing the need to rehabilitate and replace aging infrastructure. Nationwide, communities are counting on revitalized and expanded transit systems to help tackle major challenges such as climate change, air pollution, escalating congestion, and the needs of a growing and aging population. Public transit industry is supportive of federal programs that fund local infrastructure, such as the Gas Fund and the Building Canada Fund. However, more investment is needed. Des initiatives telles que le Fonds pour le transport en commun, qui vient d'être adopté,
initiatives such as the recent Public Transit Fund and the Public Transit Capital Trust offer essential assistance, but they don't offer any long-term assistance.
In order to build an effective long-term transit plan. In order to entice more and more Canadians to use public transit, it is important to offer more incentives for transit users. Through policy and taxation, the federal government can provide incentives that make transit a more attractive choice for Canadians. CUTA supports the new personal income tax credit for transit passes, but there is much more that can be done. One example, which CUTA and its partners, including FCM, have pursued for more than a decade, is tax-exempt status for employer-provided transit benefits. In Canada, public transit accounts for approximately 11% of work-related travel. CUTA is again calling on the government to support tax law changes to allow this initiative as a non-taxable benefit. On behalf of CUTA's members, I would like to thank the committee for today's opportunity.
Thank you very much for being in time as well and for your presentation. We have the Certified Management Accountants of Canada. We have Richard Monk. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, distinguished committee members and fellow presenters. I am pleased to be here with you today to represent Certified Management Accountants of Canada. CMA Canada is pleased that the committee is considering how to design a tax system that would ensure the prosperity and productivity of individual Canadians and businesses. We have followed your lead. Our submission makes 6 recommendations focusing on improving Canada's productivity record because we believe productivity growth is paramount to improving the living standards of Canadians. If we're going to ensure Canadians are in the top rank of living standards globally, and that we have the necessary resources available to invest in areas that improve our quality of life, Canada's productivity performance must be improved. Therefore, we focus on the three key drivers of productivity, namely people, physical capital, and innovation. Education and training play an essential role in driving productivity. We believe that measures need to be taken both at the highest levels of education and at the most basic level. With regard to post-secondary education, we would like to see the government build on its Budget 2007 initiative of promoting Canada as a destination of choice for top scholars from around the world. We ask you to consider the idea of a Canadian-branded scholarship program aimed at attracting the best and the brightest students in the world to Canada. Yes, we already participate in the Canada-U.S. Fulbright program, but why not launch a fully Canadian-branded international student scholarship? And once they are here, let's make it easier to encourage gifted foreign students to stay in Canada after they graduate. Having regard to training, the most basic literacy skills are essential to Canadians' standard of living. Poor literacy skills act as a drag on productivity growth. We would like to see the federal government examine a wide range of policy instruments that promote the acquisition of basic literacy and numeracy skills. This could range from investing directly in such programs to using the tax system to introduce a tax system change for employers that would provide a credit for approved training expenditures. Research demonstrates that there is a close link between investing in information and communications technology, or ICT, and increased productivity. Budget 2007 introduced a positive measure with the accelerated capital cost allowance on machinery and equipment acquired by businesses in manufacturing and processing. We would like to see the government build on this initiative by introducing a dedicated ICT adoption tax credit targeted specifically at small and medium-sized enterprises. Such businesses can become Canada's next international success story. An ICT adoption tax credit was recommended by the Telecommunications Policy Review Panel, and we believe it has great merit. In addition, the government said in Budget 2007 that it is committed to moving forward with the 5 provinces that have not yet harmonized their sales tax regimes with the GST. We strongly support this initiative and look forward to learning the steps that the government will be taking to encourage this to happen. We think of the third key driver of productivity, innovation, in pretty simple terms. It really means doing things smarter. Innovation is reinforced by investing in human and physical capital, as well as by encouraging competitive markets and protecting intellectual property rights. Another key public policy measure to encourage innovation is the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit. The SR&ED program is well known in the business community. While this program is generally recognized as being generous, Canada continues to underperform in business research and development. One change to the program that we think would encourage greater investment in R&D by our business community is to extend the refundability provisions currently available only to the smaller businesses to claimants of all sizes. An alternative is to permit larger claimants to offset the tax credit against other government levies, such as the EI premium. The objective is to have our larger companies with significant resources make better use of the program and thereby help drive greater innovation in Canada. Our second proposal to boost innovation is to combat the counterfeiting and piracy of intellectual property. Your colleagues on the Public Safety Committee and the Industry Committee made several excellent recommendations earlier this year to protect holders of IP rights. I am pleased that the government has replied favorably to these 2 committees. We believe that an important contribution to this work could be made if you were to recommend that adequate resources be made available to those departments and agencies that are in the front lines of the fight against IP piracy. Mr. Chairman, we thank you and your colleagues for your interest and look forward to responding to any questions that you might have.
Okay. And thank you very much. We'll now move on to the Direct Sellers Association of Canada. Ross Creeber, President. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, honourable members, on behalf of the 50-member companies of the Direct Sellers Association and 600,000 independent sales contractors or direct sellers across Canada, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this consultation. Direct selling companies and the independent sales contractors market a wide variety of products and services directly to the consumer, usually in the consumer's homes rather than in traditional retail establishments. The industry's combined labor force earns an estimated $966 million in income, of which $772 million was paid for in bonuses and commissions to these independent direct sellers, based on retail sales of $1.96 billion. The DSA applauds the federal government for the further reduction of the GST as an important step in getting money back in the pockets of Canadians. We also applaud the personal and business income tax reductions announced in the Finance Minister's October economic statement. These reductions are necessary to promote economic growth, job creation, and international competitiveness. The direct selling industry is a vital part of the small business sector in Canada, investing in entrepreneurial and human capital. Direct selling industry has a tremendous capacity to create jobs and to promote entrepreneurial activity amongst Canadians. We also provide accessible business opportunities with little or no investment, usually less than about $500, that is open to all Canadians without restriction with respect to gender, age, education, knowledge, or previous experience. This business opportunity is accessible to all men and women everywhere in Canada, whether they live in urban, suburban, or rural communities. While the DSA applauds the government for its reduction in the GST rate, there is one GST-related issue that we believe needs to be addressed, namely the discrimination that currently exists with the Goods and Services Direct Sellers Mechanism. The Direct Sellers Mechanism is based on pre-collection of GST or an HST by the direct selling companies on the suggested retail price. It removes a considerable burden from both the independent sales contractors and the Canadian Revenue Agency. Without the direct selling mechanism, independent sales contractors would have to be GST registered and collect and remit this to CRA. The direct sellers mechanism eliminates that step, resulting in administrative efficiencies and a cash flow advantage to the government, with no underground economy with respect to the goods and services tax in the direct selling industry. While the GST direct sellers mechanism is operating in a positive fashion, it currently discriminates against the 20 to 25% of the industry operating as independent sales agents and who are currently excluded from the mechanism. I want to emphasize to the committee that this amendment would be revenue neutral. The government would continue to receive tax at the max with no risk, and there would be no cost to the federal government. The DSA has had positive discussions with the Department of Finance and the Minister of Finance's office in order to find a straightforward technical amendment so that the direct sellers mechanism applies throughout the industry without discrimination. We believe that all parties are in agreement on how to correct this shortcoming, and of course, Mr. Chairman, we would greatly welcome an endorsement by this committee that the government should proceed with this amendment. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the Direct Sellers Association and its member companies, we appreciate the opportunity to participate in the pre-budget consultation process, and as always, we're prepared to provide our support to the government to help achieve its goals. Thank you.
And thank you very much. We'll now move back up the list to the Canadian Real Estate Association. We have Pierre Beauchamp, who's now joined us at the table. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the 95,000 members of our association who are realtors in this country, I wish to thank you for allowing us to present before your committee today. Our members, Mr. Chairman, are small business people who are involved in their community and contribute to both the life and the economy of that community. Our association also owns, as you know, as many of you would know, the familiar MLS and realtor trademarks. These marks are marks that are used by our members and indicate their strict adherence to our code of ethics. Dans la proposition pré-budgétaire que nous avons présentée,
in our pre-budget submission document already submitted to you, we list several specific recommendations that have tremendous economic and social benefit. These include establishing a comprehensive federal housing strategy, raising the borrowing limit for individuals under the Home Buyers Plan, allowing deferral of capital gains tax and recaptured capital costs for real property investments, and action to address what can only be described, which really what we believe to be an Aboriginal housing crisis.
Economic potential unless its citizens have access to suitable housing. The way to do that is with the development of a federal housing strategy. The federal strategy would tie all existing and new initiatives together and emphasize that housing and shelter are national priorities that are beyond any jurisdictional debate. That federal housing strategy should outline the government's plan to combat homelessness, provide assistance to those in housing need, maintain national housing standards, and promote home ownership as the preferred option for most Canadians. Any federal housing strategy should also include support for the National Home Buyers Plan. It is true government policy success story that combines savings for a home with savings for retirement. We're asking that the borrowing limits under the plan be raised for the first time in 15 years just to cover the rate of inflation. A federal housing strategy would also spell out the government's proposed First Nations Market Housing Fund can help to ease the Aboriginal housing crisis. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to also highlight a specific tax policy recommendation that would improve the prosperity and productivity of both citizens and businesses. This is our proposal for the rollover of capital gains tax to encourage reinvestment in Canadian communities. We are talking about investments by ordinary Canadians. These are our neighbours. There are people who invest in duplexes, other types of rental housing, and small commercial properties. From time to time, some would like to sell and reinvest either in another community or in a different type of property. But they are not selling because they're trying to avoid the tax penalty known as lock-in effect. Notre proposition ferait du gouvernement fédéral un partenaire à la fois actif et efficace sur le plan du réaménagement.
Our proposal would make the federal government an active and effective partner in the regeneration and intensification of urban neighborhoods. It would help generate more affordable rental housing. It would not be limited to housing rentals, but would apply to all small-scale investments generating both social and economic benefits. Some think that capital gains tax deferrals only benefit the wealthy.
Has produced some interesting evidence showing that, in fact, the opposite is true. For example, recent data obtained from Statistics Canada shows that in 2005, two-thirds of all taxpayers reporting real property gains had an annual net income of $50,000 or less. These are the small-scale, middle-class investors at the center of our proposal. Mr. Chairman, the capital gains tax deferral issue also remains an unfulfilled campaign promise. Canadians know that complex files such as this require careful analysis, consideration, and most importantly, the clear support of all parties, particularly in the context of a minority parliament. We urge you to recommend it, that it be a priority item for next year's federal budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you very much. And thank you for your testimony. We'll now move on to Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, Sally Brown. Sally used to be a regular at the Health Committee. Are you lost, Sally?
I thought maybe you were lost, Mr. Chair.
Maybe we're both lost. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. The Heart and Stroke Foundation is one of Canada's leading health charities, investing some $60 million a year in peer-reviewed health research and stroke research, actively engaging in every community to promote healthy living, and is a proud lead partner in the development of the Heart Health Strategy and Action Plan for Canada at the request of Minister Clement. You have our brief. I'll be much briefer today. I will begin with how we believe the federal government can help address obesity through tax policy and targeted infrastructure investments, and I will finish with our recommendation on how it can better support donor investments in health research. Mr. Chair, you know from your former leadership of the Health Committee how serious, daunting, and how potentially expensive the obesity epidemic will be if we don't seriously begin to address it now. The mechanisms we're suggesting in our brief for the federal government to help address this epidemic are not new: tax policy and targeted infrastructure funds. In terms of tax policy, the federal government has used this mechanism effectively to promote health in the past. Perhaps most notably has been its use to disincent and reduce smoking in Canada. The government's recent introduction of the Children's Fitness Tax Credit is another example. So too is the tax deduction for the purchase of public transit passes. In terms of infrastructure funds, this has been a popular tool by several federal governments to incent provincial and municipal investments where gaps have been identified and needs have to be dealt with. We are asking the federal government to once again use tax policies and infrastructure investments to enhance health. Let me be a bit more specific. For the overweight and obese, which includes some 60% of us, tax policy provides an incentive to support needed behavioral change. Research has demonstrated that foods that are health-promoting are considerably more expensive than low-nutrient, energy-dense food. As one step, we would suggest that the government revisit the current application of the GST on foods to ensure that it is applied in a manner that facilitates healthy eating. While overall GST reductions are helpful, more selected reductions will have a greater health impact. Improving access to physical activity, such as equipment, can help encourage Canadians to engage in physical activity more. Tax policy can provide an economic incentive for consumers to make the healthier choice, and is particularly relevant to Canadians of lower socioeconomic status where affordability is more of a barrier. To that end, we recommend that the government improve the Children's Fitness Tax Credit for children and youth in the various ways that we have outlined in our brief, and that it remove the GST from products that promote physical activity, such as exercise equipment, bikes, skates, hockey gear, and other sports equipment. Another important measure of addressing obesity is to create a dedicated infrastructure fund that can facilitate physical activity. Numerous studies have found a relationship between the design of our communities and obesity levels. Specifically, these studies have demonstrated that individuals living in communities that are more walkable, more easy to cycle in, are more likely to reach recommended levels of physical activity and thus are more likely to be at a healthy weight. The federal government has a role to play in facilitating the development of this type of health-promoting infrastructure, such as sidewalks, bike lanes, parks, and recreation centres. We thus urge the federal government, following along the Standing Committee of Health's report on healthy weights for healthy kids, that the federal government dedicate a specific percentage of existing infrastructure funds, not new funds, existing infrastructure funds, towards the development of infrastructure that promotes physical activity, and our brief outlines those funds that could be targeted. Tax policies and infrastructure are obviously not the only ways in which we can address obesity, but they are important when combined with other measures. Finally, let me turn to how the federal government can better support donor investments in health research. The federal government, about 5 years ago, recognized its responsibility to fund the indirect as well as the direct costs of research. The federal government's indirect costs of research program was the new mechanism chosen to meet this responsibility and fill this need. However, this program does not cover health charity-funded research. Even though by health charities investing to the tune of some $200 million a year, we are meeting a need and filling a gap that the federal government would otherwise need to fill. This is counterproductive to the program. I should add, Mr. Chair, that I'm not here to ask for that money for the health charities. I'm here to ask that that money be given to the 13 Canadian universities and its affiliating teaching hospitals, to which 80 to 90% of our money goes. Canadian donors cannot be expected to pay these costs. They already contribute to university overheads through their taxes. This is a government role. Currently, the program means that charities are at risk of being double taxed. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity.
We'll now move on to the National Aboriginal Achievement Foundation. We have Roberta Jamerson, President and CEO. Go ahead, 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Greetings to you, Mr. Chair, and to all members of the committee, and through you to the people of Canada you represent. I'm here to talk about Canada's future, and specifically that the investment of federal resources to realize the potential of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis youth is essential if Canada is to have a prosperous future. Currently, Aboriginal youth are noted for two things: the fastest growing demographic in the country and the most poorly educated in Canada. The unacceptable gap between high potential and low achievement will not close all by itself. Indeed, it will widen and be passed on to the next generation, and will be a costly burden for Canada to bear financially, socially, and politically. According to research done by the Centre for the Study of Living and announced just last week, if we could just close the gap between the education of Aboriginal children and youth as compared to the Canadian population as a whole, there would be $71 billion added to Canada's gross domestic product over the next 10 years. Then, every year after, the increase would be $8.3 billion. Far-reaching economic and social benefits would result, infused into the Canadian economy and enjoyed by all Canadians. In this context, the cost of providing Aboriginal youth access to better educational opportunities is a handsome investment in the very near future, but one that will reap benefits for generations to come. And there's another important dividend: alleviating the challenge of labor shortage that reduce economic activity. You know, many thousands of Aboriginal children entered kindergarten this year. If these children and those who follow are able to have the same educational outcome as other Canadian children, Canada's GDP would increase $21 billion when these children enter the labour market. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people could be 7% of Canada's labour force if the gap is closed. Remember that Aboriginal people will account for nearly 30% of Canada's annual natural population increase between 2001 and 2017. If we do nothing for these children, the gap will surely widen. For example, Aboriginal individuals 15 and over with degrees increased over the period between 1996 and 2001 from 7.8% to 8.9%. Over the same period, non-Aboriginal Canadians with degrees went from 20% to 21.8%. So, while more Aboriginal youth were completing university, the gap between the two groups was actually widening. Closing the gap is too complex for the federal government to do alone. I understand that. The federal government is a key leader, but we need provincial, territorial governments, Aboriginal communities, organizations, professional associations, the private sector, unions, and employers. We need their strong commitment as well. It is in that equation that the National Aboriginal Achievement Foundation provides an essential factor, indeed the ideal mechanism, to apply to the interrelated objectives of ensuring that every First Nations, Métis, and Inuit young person is motivated and confident to realize their potential, and that each one who wants to advance is not denied the opportunity for lack of funds. The Foundation already provides more scholarship funding to Aboriginal youth than any other agency in Canada outside the federal government, about $3 million annually. But we can and must do more. And we get results. We measure the impact of everything we do. We have a monitoring and tracking system, the best database in the country on Aboriginal post-secondary students. and our results demonstrate we are making a meaningful difference. So far, providing to 7,000 recipients more than $27 million in financial assistance. We are a registered charity with an eminent and professional board and publicly accountable. We receive money from corporate donors, Aboriginal and other organizations, from the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and from individuals. And we can and do leverage the contributions of one to achieve matching contributions from others. We consider ourselves much more than another competitor for the federal dollar. Having demonstrated we improve the return on investment in education of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis youth, in closing, we ask that this House Committee on Finance recommend that the government use the Foundation's capabilities to convert problems into solutions for post-secondary education and training for Aboriginal youth to help meet Canada's labour needs. Finally, we ask the committee to recommend to the Minister of Finance and to Parliament that the Foundation be utilized by the Government of Canada as a means of assuring that every Aboriginal student who is accepted for post-secondary studies has the means to realize their dream. I'd like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to present a written submission, which you all have, and to speak here today.
Okay.
Yalagoa.
And thank you very much for coming in and presenting. We now will move on to our last presenter. We have the Philanthropic Foundations Canada, Hilary Pearson, President. The floor is yours. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm conscious of the fact that as last witness, I'd better get a move on. I'm sure you want to ask some questions, so I'll be fast. Thank you for your invitation to comment on the tax measures that ensure the prosperity and productivity of residents and businesses in Canada. Our submission addresses your first question. What criteria do you believe should guide federal decisions about the changes that should be made to taxes and about whether they should be broadly based or targeted to a specific group of residents or sectors? Notre secteur, le secteur bénévole.
Our sector, the volunteer sector, makes a substantial contribution to our economy, a contribution that represents some 8% of the GDP, and our sector employs more than 1.5 million people. Our very specific mission is the following: to foster a social and regulatory framework which will encourage philanthropic activity, allowing Canadian communities to reach their full potential.
Targeted tax measures. Our first recommendation to you is to continue to expand the use of such targeted tax incentives to promote individual giving to Canadian charities. An important criterion for employing targeted tax measures is in those circumstances where there is an identifiable link between the tax measure and the resulting individual actions that would have not been undertaken otherwise. An excellent example is provided by the donor response to the new tax incentives for gifting of assets to charities. We want to thank this committee and the government for endorsing the elimination of the capital gains tax on gifts to foundations and charities. This is a cost-effective, targeted way of increasing individual giving to our communities, giving that would not have occurred as much or as quickly without it. We believe the government could introduce further targeted incentives, as done by governments in other jurisdictions, such as the UK, the United Kingdom, and the US, to provide indirect flows of private capital to the sector, in addition to direct flows through grants and contributions. Therefore, our second recommendation to you is to encourage the government to launch an examination of targeted tax measures to increase the flow of investment capital from private sources to the charitable sector. A comprehensive examination of how to promote greater indirect flows of finance to small organizations operating in the nonprofit sector is long overdue. We think it would be very valuable to conduct an external review of instruments in use in other sectors and jurisdictions to support such investment. Such instruments would include tax credits, dedicated lending instruments, and intermediary organizations to support the capital needs of charities. One of the most important challenges to productivity that's faced by the Canadian nonprofit sector is limited access by organizations to investment capital. Charities need debt finance and investment capital to finance their facilities, to bridge finance the acquisition of equipment, and to invest in soft capital such as business plans. And that capital simply isn't there. The federal government could help to bridge this gap and increase nonprofit productivity by reviewing its tax incentives and the regulatory framework that enables and encourages the creation of community finance instruments. Grants and gifts alone cannot provide sufficient funding, particularly as we look into the future and see an increasing need for social and labour market services from an ageing and declining population, a smaller group of contributing taxpayers, and new inflows of immigrants needing integration into the shrinking workforce. We urge the government to proactively initiate measures that will increase capital investment in the nonprofit sector. In other countries, government policy has evolved to support this goal, and I wanted to offer examples from the United Kingdom in particular, which offers an integrated framework of government policies to support community sector financing through increased private sector flows, not government flows. In 2000, the UK government did what our government did this past year, and enhanced tax incentives for individual donors by eliminating capital gains tax on donations of assets. They went further in 2002 by introducing a tax credit for individuals investing in community development finance institutions. These institutions provide finance to businesses operating in disadvantaged areas or to groups that are disadvantaged in the labour market who want to establish businesses. Access to capital and banking services for charities have been facilitated by the government through the Financial Services and Markets Act. And again, since 2002, UK charities have been able to access loans through a charity bank and mezzanine financing through VentureSum, which is a social investment initiative that provides risk capital and advice to small and medium-sized charities. And both of these structures are supported by grants from charitable foundations as well as by individual donors. In addition, charities can use a dedicated banking facility to create deposit accounts and access banking services. Finally, in 2004, the UK created a government-backed independent fund called Future Builders to offer access to loan capital for nonprofit organizations delivering public services on behalf of government. Most organizations have never borrowed before, so Future Builders provides support to ensure that investees have the right financial, managerial, and governance structures to take on a loan and successfully compete for contracts in the public sector. All of these measures and others have been introduced in the UK as part of a comprehensive government effort to unleash new sources of private and institutional investment in charities. The UK example illustrates what is possible when government and the community work together. In conclusion, we urge the committee to recommend an external review as a priority to enhance the flow of private capital to communities and as a complement to the very welcome new tax incentives for individual giving introduced by the government in the past two budgets. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the question and answer portion. We'll start with Mr. Turner, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming. We really appreciate hearing your testimony today. Thank you. I'm going to pick on Mr. Beauchamp for a moment. Nice to see you again, sir. And the reason I want to direct a couple of questions to you, and then my colleague, Mr. Regan, will be taking the rest of my time. We have such an accumulation of family net worth now in residential real estate. I think we're at historic high levels at the moment. So your industry is now extremely important for many reasons in our economy. Can you address the issue of affordability for a minute? Because mortgage rates have risen in the last few months, and so have resale home prices. Are we getting an affordability crunch?
Well, if you look at what has happened and the predictions that are made for the future, I think that by and large we're looking at a stabilization of the experience that we've seen with respect to prices and with respect to the market itself. We have experienced in the last year particularly a very buoyant situation in Canada. We expect that next year the markets and average prices will possibly be reduced slightly. We simply expect a soft landing, as we have predicted already, but we do not see a major crunch.
Okay, well, let me just come back to that point, because obviously in the United States we've had a very serious situation with real estate values. The subprime crisis has moved over and brought residential prices down. I think I just heard you say that you might anticipate residential retail real estate prices being slightly lower next year than they are this year.
In certain areas, yes, but you can't talk for all markets. And you have to remember that the situation in Canada is totally different than that which was experienced in the States.
Yeah, I know, so far. You're absolutely right. But my concern is you're asking for an increase in the home buyers and the home buyers plan. I understand the reason you're asking an increase, but you also got a chart here showing that the average down payment as a percentage of the purchase price has declined rather precipitously. And we now have somewhat around 90% financing of the average home, presumably new home buyer. If we have any kind of decrease coming in prices, in real estate values, is this not a recipe for disaster for people getting into real estate purchases with 5% down?
Well, let's look at what's happening with the home buyers plan. If you look at its effectiveness since 1992 in Canada, you just look at the experience last year where 53,000 homes were bought in 2006 using that particular plan. You're looking at a plan that enables Canadians to not only get involved in the home, but also at the same time marry it with their retirement vision.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I have a very specific question. If prices are going to go down a little bit next year,
well, I don't think you should hang on that in all areas, because if you look at the activity in the markets in the West, for example, and I'm looking at Calgary and Vancouver.
Yeah, well, they're going up forever. We know that. But my point was, if people in my riding are buying houses with 5% down this year, and we may see a slight decrease in the average value of a home next year, they go from 5% equity to 0. Isn't that a concern of the industry?
Well, I don't think that I don't think the decrease would be such as to have impact in that particular area. We're still looking at next year, in our view, will be the second largest record with respect to our history on MLS, for example. This year, 2007, will be the top record up to now. Next year, we're predicting will be the second highest. So we're not looking at markets decreasing here or values going down in that fashion.
I'm sorry, I thought I heard you say that. All right, Mr. Ray.
Do I get your last 3 seconds?
The time is gone. He swallowed it all. I'm sorry, Mr. Crett.
Oui. Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Damour, I just want to say that, indeed, I'm one of your allies. The Bloc Québécois agrees. We need to invest in urban transit because cities such as Montreal and Toronto already have systems and they need to expand. Can you elaborate? You were talking about additional funding of $2 billion, and you were saying that funding, that $1.3 billion would actually help cover what costs exactly? Thank you for your question, sir. Yesterday I was in Montreal, and in fact I arrived by train, and I witnessed for myself the car traffic on the highways. I met with the heads of several transit authorities in Quebec, and those authorities do have plans. They have development plans. And a transit plan usually spans over 10 years. What happens is that very often government programs have a lifespan of only 4 or 5 years. The position of the Canadian Urban Transit Association is the following. We are asking for specific effort. We are asking for $2 billion per year that is going to be spread over a higher number of years. That is part and parcel of our recommendation for a national policy on transit. Thank you very much. It's often interesting to see the spin-off effects, because a metro station that's built in Pocatière will often allow for the peripheral localities to benefit from that as well. So I just want to thank you for your comments. Mr. Beauchamp, you talk about the home buyers plan, and you say that obviously the program did not take into consideration the rate of inflation, and that the maximum loan is adjusted only every 5 years according to the CPI. Now, we agree with that. I just want to know if you have garnered the approval of other political parties. Can you please tell us what kind of effect that will have? To go from a $20,000 to $25,000 limit. Answer. If you look at the MLS system, there was an increase of some 85% between 1992 to 2006. Over the same period, the CPI grew by 27%. So if this were adjusted, we are talking about more than $25,000. I don't think it's unreasonable to entertain an increase after having waited for so long. We believe that we have the support of all Canadians, of many members of Parliament, but once again we have to make this demand because we feel that it is important to make such a readjustment. Now, if the index was built into the legislation, that would help resolve the problem? Yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. That's all for me. Point of order, please. I have a procedural matter to bring up. Twice our deliberations have been interrupted by cell phones and other electronic devices. Would you be so kind as to remind people?
Vibrate or turn them off, one or the other. Mr. Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for everyone for coming. And I only have 5 minutes, and I'm going to try to talk to most of you very quickly. So I'm going to start with CUTA. I'm actually a big supporter. I'm from Burlington and big supporter of urban transit, and have been. My colleagues will affirm that. I talk to them about it too often. But just a fairly quick question. Any money from the federal side, your organization is expecting for capital, not for operating?
Mr. Chair, I want to thank the member for the question. That's what we're asking right now. $2 billion is for capital.
Capital, not operating. And because I did a little bit of studying of what the federal government does south of the border, yes. And it's basically capital that they support. And I don't disagree with you on us having a role as federal government on that. So.
And I wish to thank the member for his support for public transit. It's very appreciated.
No problem. I had a question. Oh, just a clarification for Ms. Brown. So you're okay with the child fitness tax credit that we've offered? You just want to increase it? And when you say all Canadians, you'd like to see it extended to adults then also. Is that what you're telling me here?
No, we think it should be much broader than it is, however, and that there should be other mechanisms targeted to adults to help them also lead a healthier lifestyle.
Okay. And just for a clarification for myself, I had a grocery group come see me this week, and they tried to tell me that a piece of fruit doesn't attract GST, but if it's cut up and put in a tray with other fruit, it attracts GST. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
That's the kind of thing. It's the thing that if you buy one donut, you pay GST. If you buy 6 donuts, you don't have to pay GST.
Okay.
So I think there's some sensitivities around there we should look at.
Okay, I appreciate that. Ross, I'm not sure I say your last name, Graber. Just so for my clarification, are most of your members, I think you have to have sales of 60,000 or something before you need a GST number. I think that's the number off the top of my head. Would most of your For the thing you're recommending here, is that to avoid your members getting a GST number? Is that what that is?
Yeah, that's partially the reason. What it does is the direct selling companies pre-collect the GST at the time of the sale to the independent direct seller, and the direct selling companies then remit the tax to the federal government on behalf of those who they collected it from.
Okay, I may call you on that to get more clarification. Ms. Jameson, thank you for coming. I think your organization is absolutely fabulous. I would just, well, there's no numbers in here other than how much money you've given out. What percentage of the money that your foundation generates or gets is from the federal government? I couldn't see where that is.
Our public sector funding, the federal government specifically has given 2 endowments to the organization, one of $12 million, one of 10. We distribute the interest of that.
Right.
On an annual basis, the Government of Canada gives, I want to give you the figure, and I will follow up with the exact figure, but public sector funds for distribution of scholarships is about half. Private sector also provides funding, and individual donors as well.
Okay. Well, I want to congratulate you on the work you're doing, and hopefully that will continue.
Thank you.
Ms. Pearson, we had another non-profit fundraising organization, not the foundations, but the Fundraisers of Canada. I forget what the actual organization was called.
Professionals, right. Probably. Yeah.
They talked about the donation of land and having it treated basically the capital gains issue that we dealt with other issues. Do you see from a foundation point of view that the land issue is something in terms of ecological land? Is that a demand? Is that an option that you've looked at?
Well, I represent the grant makers,
Right.
not the fundraisers, and so my members typically are not in a position to seek gifts from others. Some of my members are certainly involved in the work of the Nature Conservancy, for example, which would very much appreciate, I think, tax incentives for more donations of ecologically sensitive land. So I think that in general in the nonprofit sector it would be much appreciated.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Mr. Monk, just quickly, I think you had 6 items here. I think we've done this with the Public Safety Committee and Industry Committee to combat counterfeiting and piracy of intellectual property. I think we implemented that. When was this? Is this something you've written recently, or was it written during the summer when we asked?
August.
It was done in August. Is that
That's it? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Very quickly, yeah, Mr. McClellan. The floor is yours.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Ms. Pearson. I have a colleague from Windsor. His name is Brian Massey. He recently made a proposal. We should give special tax treatment to charities, something similar that applies to political entities. I'm talking about tax credits. If we are to adopt this, we should also make sure that the charities are subject to an audit system. The media was rather receptive to this idea. There was an editorial written in favor of this proposal. So my question to you is this: would you be in favor of such a tax measure?
I'll answer that in English. I haven't actually thought about that particular issue. Again, I represent a group of organizations who don't tend to benefit from those kinds of incentives, except in the actual establishment of the foundation. Right. I represent private foundations and some public foundations largely. So I'll answer in general terms as opposed to specifically on behalf of my members. Certainly there is an interest in having greater incentives tax incentives for giving. I think incentives are generous, and I have to say the Department of Finance has many times told us that they believe the incentives that are provided now for giving of cash and now assets are as generous as anywhere in comparable jurisdictions, certainly in North America, but probably in Europe as well, more generous. Does that mean that they're as generous as they could be? No. And I think that it would certainly be greeted with a lot of enthusiasm if we were to receive a boost in the incentive that was provided. I do think, though, that the message in this brief is that it's not just giving of cash by individuals in the form of charitable donations that is important to the nonprofit sector. In fact, the nonprofit sector needs to have access to sources of financing which could take the form of loans or debt capital in some form. And that the capital market in Canada for charities is seriously underdeveloped, and that's what we'd like to see more emphasis on now.
Vous avez très bien soulevé ça en faisant votre comparaison avec l'Angleterre. Je me termine avec vous.
You were very correct in drawing the comparison with the UK. I just wanted to also comment on the quality of the French of your written submission. It was excellent. Ms. Jameson, I've taken note of your recommendation. I didn't realize the magnitude of the gap that you talk about in your document. I just want to assure you that we have heard your message loud and clear, and we're going to do our utmost to follow up on that. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the witnesses for coming in. We will not adjourn the meeting right now, but we certainly would ask that you retreat from the table. We do have one motion that I believe Mr. Kret would like to introduce. It's on here. We'll allow 5 minutes. I know the bells are ringing. We'll allow 5 minutes, and hopefully we can get this completed. We'll see. But
Okay.
go ahead. Mr. Kret.
La motion est claire. Je suis prêt à voter.
The motion is very clear. I'm ready to put it to a vote.
We have debate on the motion. Mr. Dykstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will do my best not to take a lot of time on this. I realize we do have a vote, but I think it's pretty clear. It's pretty important for us to, on the government side, to put our thoughts on the record on this. We certainly, and Mr. Rajat is here as the chair of the industry committee to certainly show his support for the work that he did in the committee that he chaired to bring this report forward. And if certainly we doesn't look like we have a lot of time, but certainly proving that we are intent on moving forward to help manufacturing and industry in this country, and the report certainly indicates the direction that we want to take. It also shows by the actions that we've taken in the 2007 budget that we are intent to do so. But let me just point out a couple of things, Mr. Chair, and one is that we have tried to work with Mr. Crete to amend the motion to be able to support it. But what in fact we have is a request of the minister that will effectively tie his hands. He will not be able to act promptly. It's very clear in the report, page 51, and just when we're talking about the SR and ED tax incentive program, it talks to and speaks to the fact that we are considering moving forward on that. The industry committee moved to consider this. And I think it's incumbent upon us to move forward as quickly as we can, but as effectively as we possibly can. It's not responsible to move this motion forward without a true understanding of cost, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to quote from one of the last sentences that Mr. Rajat had in the chair's forward to the report. It speaks very directly, and it says, the recommendations presented in this report should be implemented in a timely fashion. If there were an amendment that Mr. Crete would have supported, we certainly could have supported the motion to be able to speak about a timely fashion, to speak that this can move forward within an allocation of time that makes sense for both the ministry, makes sense for both the government, and quite frankly makes sense for the manufacturing industry that was here yesterday and spoke directly to the fact that they didn't want us to move forward, didn't want us to spend funds on something that wasn't going to have a direct benefit, wasn't going to have a direct impact on the industry itself. I'm merely suggesting, Mr. Chair, that if that amendment would be accepted, we certainly would be supporting. But as the motion stands now, we will be abstaining from that vote.
Do you have an amendment?
I do have an amendment, but as I understand it, Mr. Crete is not prepared to accept the amendment. Happy to read the amendment into the motion, but I've already spoken with Mr. Crete.
As the chair of the committee, whether Mr. Crete will accept an amendment or not isn't my issue. My issue is, are you making an amendment? If you're making an amendment, we'll put it on the table to debate the amendment. If you're not, then we'll just carry on with the debate on the motion.
Well, the amendment that I would move, I'm happy to respond to your request, and that is that the committee, if I look at the motion, that basically removing the word promptly and introducing removing the words recommends that the government promptly and introducing the amendment that the government recommends that the motion recommends that the government act upon the recommendations on tax measures in the unanimous report.
Okay. Do we have that?
So
you move promptly, recommend that the government promptly act upon the recommendations. That's your amendment?
That's my amendment.
OK, votons sur l'amendement.
Excuse me?
Let us vote on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, there's already been discussions. I think we're ready to vote. The report's been hanging around since February 07. We're ready to go.
Okay.
Question.
Okay, I'm going to recognize Mr. Rajat, who's the industry chair on the amendment. Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, you cannot recognize. There's already 4 members on the table plus yourself.
I can.
We're not.
You can only be recognized with.
Come on.
So you're not going to recognize the chair of the committee that is actually here to
discuss. Mr. Dexter, this is the question. Do we want to hear from the chair of the industry committee on the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Is that what the committee is saying?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect,
all in favor of that, or in favor of listening to the chair of the industry committee? Okay. I think a majority. Is it unanimous consent? The clerk is informing me it's a consensus of the committee. I don't see it, regardless of that. So what we'll be doing is voting on the amendment as it has been presented by Mr. Dykstra. Are we ready for this? This is on the amendment. It's on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment? Opposed? Okay, it's defeated. So we have a motion on the main motion. All in favor? Opposed? And it's carried.
Unanime.
What's that?
Unanime. Il n'y a pas eu de vote contre. Question d'éclaircissement, Monsieur le Président. Il n'y a pas eu de.
There were no votes against, therefore it is a unanimous vote in favor.
Meeting adjourned.
I don't report abstention.